Okay, I think it's 1 o'clock. It's Tuesday. Welcome to the next installment of our HDF Clinic. Just as we always do, I think nobody submitted any questions before the meeting, so yes, there aren't any. Still, for those who are in attendance here today, are there any questions at this point? Otherwise, we will just come back to questions many more times. Okay, no questions. Then let's just start. There's still an open action item for me. I'll get back to that, I promise, one day. For now, let's just look at announcements. There was one announcement, namely and it's all linked here, the virtual object, how to write a simple virtual object layer connector. That tutorial was postponed, and the new date is February the 25th between 11 and 1 p.m. Central Time, that is. And yeah, you can still register for it. So it has shifted. I think there is no upper limit or restriction on how many people can attend and so forth. So if this is something that interests you, and I highly recommend it, feel free, go there, register. Okay. Any questions? No? Okay. Onto the forum. Lots of interesting discussions. In fact, there was replies coming back just as I was putting these notes together. So I haven't had a chance yet to reply to the sort of latest comments. And I will actually say in the comments that for some people who by time zone or otherwise can make it here, just alert them to the fact that we have these clinics, and then if they want to talk in person or sort of have a much quicker turnaround, then maybe coming to this clinic is a good thing. And so anyway, there was a question by someone about he wanted to select, he had a data set and he wanted to do selections on that data set, and as he thought that involved variable length data. But I think unfortunately, as we are often tempted to start with a more complex problem rather than a simple problem and build up from there, I think he or she mixed two different things. One is to get the selections right, and getting the selections right depends on if it's a point selection that you have selected the right coordinates, or if it's a hyperslab selection, there is this start, stride, count, block pattern, and getting those parameters right is sometimes a little iffy. And I think unfortunately, well, first of all, getting these selections right, meaning that the selection in memory and in the file match, that has nothing to do with the data type. That's just bean counting or arithmetic. I mean, the pretty much the only requirement is that the number of elements that you are selecting in memory has to be equal to the number of elements that you are selecting in the file. And it is not really important what the dimensions are of these data spaces and so forth, but the counts certainly have to add up. And we covered that in a previous episode. And then, of course, in the parallel case, things get a little more complicated. But in a sequential case, which is what this was about, getting the selections right, just play with integer data sets. Don't drag the whole variable length story and so forth in there. It has nothing to do with that, and it's much easier to work these selection things out with just simple integer data sets. And then once you've worked that out, we can talk about typing. Now, what it appeared is, and I think I slowly begin to understand what the user actually wanted, but here is what's in that post. He posted an example, which is great, where he basically describes the kinds of records. I think that's what is fair to call these records that he wanted to store. And so he has these what he calls these structs called sdata that have two fields, a 64-bit unsigned integer b and a 16-bit unsigned integer a. And then he uses that what he calls sdata struct either in a capacity where he has triplets of those sdata. So in HDF speak, that might be represented as an array type, or where it's kind of indefinite, so it's not known exactly how many of these sdata elements will be present, and then you would indeed use a variable length data type. However, I think where things get a little confused is so if you look at these structs and then try to construct HDF5 data types from this is what, I mean, assuming you really want to include in what you store in the file these integer fields a, b, and then an element and so forth, then you would represent this as a compound type. So this is what I would call the surface type. So of course, data types in HDF5 can be nested, so you can have a compound where the field in turn is another compound, or it could be an array type, or it could be all kinds of things. And so the surface type of a struct like this would be something that has three fields. You could use the C field names as your compound data type field names, although there's no obligation to do that. It just makes sense. But you can rename them if you want. And then so the first three fields in this compound data type A, B, and LM would be straightforward. So with these compound types, you would do an H5T under H5T create compound. And then you can add these fields one by one. You have to basically provide the offset of that field and its size, and then register them, so to speak, with the compound type. And then before you can add this variable length sequence of sdata, you would have to construct this variable length data type, and then you would register that type as the last field in this compound type, and everything would be good. Then you can go ahead and construct data sets or attributes with that type, and you can read and write and so forth. And so I guess that's the story. And I just saw before we came on air here, I saw the user posted a reply, because unfortunately in his code he used a variable length string as the thing into which he wrote these elements, and that just is not appropriate in this case. So maybe he is just confused about where the variable length string element comes in. I mean, just looking at this definition, unless you are talking about byte sequences as strings, that's one thing, but that wouldn't even be appropriate here, because one characteristic of variable length strings in HDF5 is that they are zero terminated. So if you have an array of these guys, it's kind of chance if there's a zero here and there. It really depends on how the compiler decides to lay out these things. And so variable length strings are definitely not what's asked for here. So I guess, in a few more iterations we will finally get to the bottom of what this user is looking for. But this is sort of just a heads up. I'm going to pause here and ask, are there any questions? Okay, we'll just press on. Next up, somebody asked a question about dynamically changing file access property lists. And so before I answer that, I'm going to sort of talk a little bit more about the background. Number one is, okay, what are these file access property lists? Well, property lists, if you look at the HDF5 API, they are, I think the term that people would use, they are ubiquitous. They are just everywhere. They are omnipresent. The reason for these property lists and properties, those are, if you wish, the elements in a property list, is that you want to configure or customize the behavior of certain API calls. And that could be for read or write. We have these so-called dataset transfer property lists, or in the case of when you open or create a file, you can have these things that we call file access properties or file creation properties. Now, the main difference from a user perspective between file access properties and file creation properties is that file creation property lists, if you wish, are considered fundamental to the creation of the file, and they are stored with the file in some form. Whereas file access property lists are sort of temporary, transient. They are really relevant only in the context of accessing an HDF5 file. And there might be different ways of how you access the same HDF5 file, but as a result, they are not persisted in the file. So they are really, call it an artifact or an element of the runtime accessing an HDF5 file, and the next time you run your program, for whatever reason, you may choose to access that HDF5 file in a different way. And the specific example that the user is after here is, there is in HDF5 you can set a so-called alignment constraint. And what that really means is, through that alignment constraint, you can hint to the HDF5 library when it then lays out objects, things that are stored in the HDF5 file. You can say, well, if you think about the sort of the file as a logically linear address space where you have sort of offsets, logical byte offsets, you can impose restrictions on whether an object can be placed at pretty much any offset in the file, or you can say, well, I want the offset, for example, to be always divisible by 8 or something like that. And then there is another parameter how you can influence that alignment. You can say, well, I want this alignment constraint to be in effect only for objects or things whose size exceeds a certain threshold. So that's why in H5P set alignment there are two constraints. One is the threshold, where you sort of control the granularity of the type of the size of the object for which you consider imposing that constraint. So if the threshold is 0, then it means blanket. So no matter how small or how tiny that object is, you want the following alignment constraint to be there. So take a 1 kilobyte or 128 byte, whatever suits you, constraint to be in effect. And that is really a file access property list, in the sense that another application, so once that file is closed, another application may choose different alignment constraints. That is really not stored in the file. So if you later open that file and say, I mean, you can discover whether the object addresses of certain things are aligned along certain boundaries, but from that you cannot necessarily conclude that, oh, those other applications must have used those as alignment constraints. It might just be chance or serendipity. So yeah, this is not persisted, and different applications may impose different alignment constraints. The more important thing, however, is that you have to set these file access property lists before you open or create the file. So if you look at the reference manual entry for H5F open or H5F create, in the case of H5F create, there are, I believe, two property list arguments in that call. One is a file creation property list, and the other is a file access property list. And whereas in the case of H5F open, since at that point in time the file would have been created already, otherwise you can't open it, there's only one property list argument, which is this file access property list argument. And so at that point, the file access properties that you provide in that file access property list are in effect, and you cannot change them on an open file. And the examples, I think, where the user was a little confused was that, yes, in the API there is a call where if you have a file handle of the file that you opened or that you created, that HID_T, call it file, there is an API call where you say, get me the access property list. And what that will do is it will basically look at that file and create a copy of the property list that was in effect when that file was accessed, meaning it was opened or created. And you can play with that file access property list. However, it is not going to have any effect on that file, because A, you are dealing with a copy of that of the file access property list, and B, this is not something that is supported, that you can sort of dynamically change file access properties. The truth is also that there are many examples of file access property list alignment being one where it might make sense, although again in my response I sort of point out that in a way I would like to see a use case. Why would it be beneficial for performance or otherwise to change this alignment threshold dynamically? There is another group of, or there are other file access properties for which changing them dynamically wouldn't make a lot of sense. For example, the virtual file driver that you use to access an HDF5 file is a file access property. For example, let's say you have an HDF5 file and then you would like to open that in a parallel, meaning let's say MPI parallel program. So you would be using the MPI IO based virtual file driver, but that is a file access property list in the sense that the HDF5 file is an HDF5 file. There is no difference between a sequential or parallel HDF5 file. There's only one kind of HDF5 file. There aren't different parallel HDF5 files or sequential. There's no such distinction. And so changing that virtual file driver dynamically, and that in this case would mean without closing the file, wouldn't, for example, make a lot of sense. So it would be interesting. The user hasn't replied yet, but it would be interesting. I would like to hear what they hope to achieve by changing this alignment dynamically. And I would add to that, there are things that were, this is setting the alignment, I believe this has been around probably, if not since version 1.0, but definitely version 1.2. So this goes back to the very early days of HDF5. In the meantime, there have been improvements along the lines of paged allocation, for example, where you can control or constrain the allocation of space in the file and say, I want this to occur in 1 megabyte increments or something like that, and also support free space management, for example, beyond file open and close. That in those circumstances, this setting actually has no effect. So and that's documented if you look at the documentation, I believe, for H5P set alignment, it will say that if you use paged allocation or something like that, this call has no effect whatsoever. So again, it'll be interesting to hear what the user has to say. And but yeah, just a quick file access property list versus file creation property lists. Any questions so far?
Yes, Gerd, could you clarify? Could you clarify that when the file is created initially using a particular file access property list, then it's closed and the HDF5 file is handed off to another party to read it, for instance. The second party does that second party have any way of finding out what the file access property list was at the time the file was created?
No.
But it doesn't need it.
It doesn't need it, right? All they see is really these file creation property lists. As I said earlier, file creation properties are stored. So, for example, a file creation property would be you can set, not that that's very common to change, but theoretically you can control the size of offsets, for example, in the file, which by default is the size of offsets would be 8 bytes. So 8-byte unsigned integers, that's how you express offsets in the file. Now, if you want that to be 4-byte unsigned integers or something, then you can technically change it. I'm not saying that's a good idea to do that, but it's possible. But those are file creation property lists in the sense that you will see some manifestation of those in the file. And indeed, if you look at the file format specification, you will actually see in what we call the super block, there is a field where it says size of offsets and so forth.
Okay, but these are really, then all of these things are mutable depending upon how, let's say, the second party wishes to read the file. You create your own file property list based on what you desire at that point.
Yeah. So, for example, if the second party takes that HDF5 file and they say, we would like to keep this in memory. So they would like to load this entire HDF5 file as one big blob in memory to avoid any disk I/O whatsoever. Well, that would be a file access property. It would be the so-called core VFD, as we call it, the core virtual file driver, where as part of this H5P create H5P file access, they would then say H5P set fapl core, and that would tell the HDF5 library, okay, that user really wants me to take that entire HDF5 file, load it as a buffer into memory, and then work with it there. But it's really just access, and there's nothing in the file whether it's been handled one way or another as a trace. Okay, thanks. Yes, let's talk about developer productivity in the form of snippets. And what I'm talking about here is that when you, as a developer, when you write code, of course, the HDF5 API doesn't change that much. So you keep typing the same function names and so forth, and any kind of help that you can get in speeding up that process and taking a little bit of that repetition out is welcome. And also maybe doing syntax checking as a side effect. So for example, if you feed it an argument, if you fed to an HDF5 function an argument of an incompatible type, you would like to be alerted about that and things like that. And again, going back to the early days of Turbo Pascal or something like that, UI creators have had great ideas. And then, yeah, if you are familiar with the Microsoft world, it goes under the term IntelliSense in Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code. And underneath is something that nowadays there's actually a protocol specification for that. It's called LSP, or Language Server Protocol. And I've linked it here. And there is indeed, in my choice of tool, Emacs, there is support for LSP, and it's called LSP mode, and exists for all kinds of languages: C, C++, Python, Java, Scala, pick your favorite. And it gives you actually a very dynamic, interactive experience if the type is not right, assuming you work with a typed language or something like that. But I would submit that it's, depending on what kind of machine you are using, it's pretty resource intensive, because this compiler or interpreter, whichever language you're dealing with, has to run in the background and constantly sort of parse snippets of your code or parts of your code, of the syntax tree, if there is such a thing. And on the downside, well, it's not really a downside, but depending on what you are trying to achieve, this is of course something that gives you feedback about a very specific part of your code, rather than it's not what I call here a templating mechanism. So if you have typically a section of code that is pretty standard, and you just want one keystroke or a few keystrokes, and boom, you have that entire section of code there, then this is not something that LSP mode would do for you. And there are sort of separate snippet mechanisms. I believe Visual Studio or VS Code, you can have snippets there as well. But okay, I'm going to focus here on Emacs. And one of those systems in Emacs is called YesSnippet. And I linked it here, and it's very easy to use in your Emacs configuration. You can just include it, and then you point it basically to a directory where you store your snippets. And I just started experimenting a little bit with those snippets, and there's a repo on GitHub where I'm posting some of these, and I'll give you a quick demo of what this looks like. So there is a directory here called cmode, because these snippets are tied to in which language you are doing certain things, and we can just peek at what they will look like, and I'll show them in action right now. It's not that hard to learn. So you can then type things like ASCII, for example, and then the trigger, if you wish, for all these snippets is always the tab key. So I can, in an Emacs buffer, I can type ASCII, and then I hit tab, and it will automatically expand it to the to the enumerator for the character encoding for ASCII. So H5T_C set ASCII. Or if I type, for example, UTF-8, it would insert this. So let me just show you that in action, and I will just make it a little bigger. For example, I can say ASCII, and then I hit tab, and that's what it does. It just replaces it. Or UTF-8, for example, tab. Okay, and you might say, okay, that's nice, but okay, big deal. Now, you can then do things for MPI, for API calls. Like, for example, let's say you want to set the character encoding for attribute names or linked names. And you can define, I just chose an abbreviation. I'm not going to call it H5P set character encoding, or I forgot already what the actual API call is called. So I call it char_enc, and if I hit tab, so that automatically expands it to the call H5P set char encoding, and then I can change the name of the handle, and if I hit tab again, then it asks me actually here whether I want ASCII or UTF-8. So if I say I want UTF-8, that's what it's going to put there. And so then I can get on with my day, and it's sort of, yeah, just little helpful extensions. You can also take that to the next level. So here I have two standard snippets sort of for the main functions of a sequential or parallel HDF5 program. So if I say, for example, H5 main and hit tab, it just expands that into, okay, when I write a main program for HDF5, I know I have to include HDF5.h, I have typically include standardlib.h, I need a main function, and then the first thing I typically do is I create a file. Okay, I create a file and I close the file and then return some kind of return value. But you can do the same thing with, for example, the parallel variant where MPI gets involved, so I call that H5P main. And again, this is all configurable. If you don't like my naming, change it. So if I go to the end, hit tab, this is H5P main. So in addition to HDF5.h, I need MPI.h, I need an MPI communicator. I typically want to know what is the size of my communicator, what is the rank of an MPI process, and retrieve those. And then I want to set the FAPL, talking about file access property list. You have to set the FAPL to MPI.io, and then create a file again in parallel this time, and then in the end close the file and finalize MPI and so forth. But it's a clever way of defining your own snippets that you find yourself using over and over again, and just picture, type, how many times do you really want to type this? So it's much easier to define a snippet and then just get on with your life. And there are a few more, but I would be interested to learn what people think about them. And I can see we are almost out of time. So in some cases, I created two versions. So here's, for example, the group creation, H5G create, and then something with an underscore. Let me quickly maybe show that. To create a group, H5G create tab, that just says, okay, I want to create a group. I have to provide some kind of handle, the name of the group, and then just use the default link access or link creation property, group creation property, and group access property lists. But now contrast that with, just for syntax, I'm going to add a semicolon. You could also say H5G create with an underscore. And what I do in this case, this is sort of the case, here I go with the vanilla defaults, H5P default for everything. However, when I add an underscore, then I have the ability to actually modify these guys. So I have the location, this thing, and then it fills in sort of variable names for these. But I can still, if I don't like this, I can still go with HPD, H5, oh, it's H5PD. Then it will, so I can replace it manually by H5P default if I like. And anyway, so there are these, that's my convention, but then again, I'd be interested to hear from people in the community if they have a better convention, if they have much more clever snippets. And but this is just a start, and I'll just keep adding as I have time to these snippets, and then everybody can pass an opinion on that. Okay, sorry we are over time. Thanks for coming as always, and I'll see you next week. Thank you. Bye.